During the lively 1960s, small bakeries across America offered inventive treats, showcasing ingredients and techniques passed down through generations. Families flocked to neighborhood pastry counters for warm bread, whimsical confections, and aromatic delights unlike anything seen in modern, mass-produced aisles. Over the decades, shifting tastes, bigger commercial operations, and changing lifestyles gradually left these beloved favorites behind. In our deep dive, we'll explore 20 iconic 1960s bakery creations that vanished from everyday view, unraveling the stories behind their rise to fame and eventual disappearance. Prepare to rediscover the sweet nostalgia of a bygone era when community bakeries truly flourished. Number 1. Lady Baltimore Cake. This elegant white layer cake once reigned supreme in neighborhood bakeries, especially across the American South, but it popped up nationwide in the 1960s when nostalgic home bakers and large-scale pastry shops aimed to evoke the golden age of old America. Typically composed of delicate white layers, dried fruit, nuts, and a fluffy meringue frosting, Lady Baltimore Cake presented an airy sweetness unlike heavier confections of the era. Baby boomers who grew up during the 20th century might recall it showcased at weddings or anniversary celebrations, often hinted at in retro commercials that promised a taste of history. As corporate baking conglomerates rose in power and demanded quicker production methods, classic recipes that required extended beating, fresh egg whites, and real butter began fading away. Shifting American tastes in the 1970s, combined with the influx of easier cake mixes, caused smaller bakeries to drop this treat from their main offerings. By the 1980s, the Lady Baltimore Cake had nearly vanished, replaced by simplified sheet cakes with stable frostings suited to large-scale distribution. Today, it remains a niche curiosity for food historians and vintage enthusiasts, sometimes revived in local fairs or in specialized bakeries that wish to preserve 1960s nostalgia. Number 2. Charlotte Russe. Popular in the 1930s through the 1960s, Charlotte Russe found its place in glass bakery cases as a chilled delight made with sponge cake, custard, fruit gelée, or whipped cream. Baby boomers in cities like New York might remember sidewalk stands or pastry shops selling single-serving portions in paper cups topped with a swirl of whipped cream and a bright cherry. Over time, changing consumer habits, along with evolving health consciousness, challenged pastry chefs to simplify their menus. The Charlotte Russe was especially affected because it required specialized molds, fresh dairy, and careful layering. Although it thrived during the 1960s golden era, it gradually disappeared when big supermarket chains began preferring baked goods with longer shelf lives. Production complexity, as well as a shift away from old-fashioned desserts, contributed to its decline. By the 1980s, Charlotte Russe was mostly a nostalgic reference in old movie reels and memory-filled discussions among older Gen X and baby boomers who recalled buying them after school. These days, only a handful of traditional bakeries or vintage-themed pop-ups will recreate this treat, making it largely a sweet memory from an America before modern convenience foods reshaped consumer demand. Number 3. Spice Crumbled Doughnuts. Throughout the mid-century, donut shops in the 1960s capitalized on warm spices like nutmeg, cinnamon, and allspice in their batters. These spice-crumbled donuts developed a devoted following among families who visited small corner bakeries on weekend mornings. Often sold as a cozy alternative to the typical glazed ring, they boasted a textured, crumbly topping made from bits of sugar, flour, and fragrant spices. Baby boomers in suburban neighborhoods would recognize the comforting aroma drifting into the streets from local shops. However, as industrial donut chains grew in popularity, standardizing recipes for quicker turnaround and uniform presentation, these distinctly spiced oldies started disappearing from display cases. By the late 1970s, more mainstream flavor profiles like plain glazed, chocolate frosted, and frosted sprinkles dominated, Wider distribution demanded pastries with consistent sweetness, whereas spice crumble doughnuts were labor-intensive, making them less appealing in a mass production setting. Nostalgic pastry enthusiasts still talk about these vanished favorites when leafing through vintage recipe books or family photo albums that show simpler times and unique local offerings that seldom made it beyond the local block. Number 4. Pineapple upside-down Danish. Borrowing inspiration from the beloved pineapple upside-down cake. Popular since the 1930s, some 1960s bakeries introduced a Danish pastry twist by layering pineapple slices and brown sugar syrup on a base of laminated dough. This treat evoked a taste of the tropics at a time when post-war America increasingly embraced bright flavors and fun presentations. The combination of tart pineapple, caramelized sugar, and buttery pastry briefly dazzled baby boomers looking for something fresh at the local bakery. Yet, the high labor cost, especially in shaping and proofing the pastry, led big commercial bakers to favor pre-made fruit fillings for danishes. The shift to more shelf-stable jam or pie filling centers crowded out the more delicate pineapple topping. By the 1970s, mass production overshadowed smaller artisan shops that had once innovated such sweets. Consequently, pineapple upside-down Danish pastries never made the leap into large-scale grocery distribution, effectively erasing them from mainstream American menus. Modern attempts at reviving them occasionally pop up in boutique bakeries or on food blogs dedicated to retro or rock and roll era pastries, reminding older generations how localized creativity once flourished. Number 5. Hermit Bars. In many 1960s bakeries, Hermit Bars were a staple. These chewy, spice-laden cookies packed with raisins, dates, or nuts originated much earlier in American history, but achieved widespread popularity during the mid-century. The name Hermit reflected how well they kept when stored, making them ideal for longer shipping and lunchbox treats. Particularly among baby boomers, Hermit Bars were a comforting snack reminiscent of grandparents' kitchens and old commercials touting homemade goodness. Yet as America moved past the 1960s into the 1970s and 1980s, desserts with less overt spice and more immediate sweetness gained traction. Big brand cookie offerings overshadowed old bakery mainstays because consumers wanted bright packaging and consistent taste. Smaller pastry shops that specialized in Hermit Bars began closing, challenged by urban development and changing demographics. Hermits eventually drifted off bakery menus, replaced by chocolate chip cookies or brownies that demanded fewer specialty ingredients. Despite fading from mainstream recognition, some older Gen X individuals might still treasure childhood memories of these bar cookies, occasionally seeking out a homemade recipe for that nostalgic flavor of the 20th century's earlier decades. Number 6. Banana Flip. Typically found in small, independently owned 1960s bake shops, the banana flip was a single-serving sponge cake folded around a light banana-flavored cream filling. It represented a portable delight for people rushing between daily errands or children browsing after-school sweets. The artificial banana essence paired with sweet whipped filling appealed to those wanting a quick sugar rush before dinner. Yet it eventually lost favor when artificially flavored pastries began to carry a negative connotation in the 1970s and beyond. Demand for more natural ingredients and simpler baked goods clashed with the processed cream. Banana flips did appear in some brand-name snack lines, but they never maintained robust popularity once consumer tastes shifted toward fresh fruit or health-forward confections. Additionally, supermarket shelves in the 1980s started stocking a broader range of items, from low-fat muffins to fruit-based pastries, pushing banana flips to the brink. Today, only older nostalgia seekers might recall the sweet, artificial banana taste and fluffy texture that once captured a fleeting moment in the mid-century bakery scene. Number 7. Tomato Soup Cake. While it sounds unusual to modern ears, the tomato soup cake gained moderate popularity in the 1960s, especially among thrift-minded home bakers and a handful of small-town bakeries. By mixing condensed tomato soup into the batter, bakers discovered a moist, spiced cake with hints of cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves, plus a subtle tang from the soup. This phenomenon attracted curious customers who loved novelty baked goods reminiscent of Depression-era resourcefulness. Baby boomers who spent time in community potlucks or local church bake sales might remember glimpsing slices of this cake near fruit pies and brownies. However, as the national economy shifted in the late 1960s and convenience foods expanded, the novelty factor wore thin. Over time, repeated references in old cookbooks or as an odd anecdote in old Hollywood squares shows preserved its legend more than its actual presence. By the 1970s, health-conscious consumers began looking skeptically at cakes containing processed canned goods, reducing its appeal even more. Eventually, it vanished from most bakery menus, though some retro-themed cooking channels or vintage recipe enthusiasts still experiment with it, intrigued by the blend of sweet and savory flavors that define an era of simpler, resourceful baking. Number 8. Oatmeal molasses bread. During the 1960s, small hometown bakeries often used hearty, unrefined ingredients in certain loaves, with oatmeal molasses bread showcasing earthy flavors and dense textures. This loaf drew upon old tradition from the 1930s and 1940s war-era baking, when sweeteners like molasses provided a cost-effective alternative to more expensive refined sugar. By the 1960s, it served as a health bread, or at least a wholesome choice for families seeking something more substantial than processed white bread. Baby boomers recall sandwiches stuffed with cold cuts or peanut butter on thick slices of dark, subtly sweet oatmeal molasses bread. Nonetheless, once large commercial bakeries streamlined their operations to produce standard white or soft wheat loaves in the 1970s, more rustic bread types faced an uphill battle in chain supermarkets. Over time, bread with distinct flavors or denser crumb got edged out by softer, mass-friendly varieties. As the 20th century advanced, American nostalgia for simpler times persisted, but the bread supply overwhelmingly favored uniform softness over older recipes. Oatmeal molasses bread eventually drifted into home baking circles rather than bakery shelves, leaving behind a memory of a hearty, old-fashioned loaf in the minds of those who grew up in the era of family-run bakeries. Number 9. Butterscotch Pinwheel Rolls. These sticky sweet spiral buns dotted with brown sugar, butter, and sometimes nuts made an appearance in many 1960s bakery displays, right alongside cinnamon rolls. The distinct caramel aroma that wafted through small pastry shops enticed morning customers grabbing coffee. Baby boomers might recall the swirling patterns of golden butterscotch sauce as they unraveled each roll. However, they required extra time to create that layered effect, and once large-scale bakeries started producing pastries in bulk, delicate pinwheel techniques didn't fit the industrial model. Additionally, the rise of simpler frosted cinnamon rolls overshadowed more complex flavor profiles in the 1970s. Consumers gravitated toward consistent sweetness and easily packaged baked goods. By the end of the decade, the artisanal flair behind fresh butterscotch sauce dwindled in mass production lines, and small bakeries that had specialized in homemade sauces struggled against rapidly expanding supermarket, in-store bakeries. Gradually, butterscotch pinwheel rolls faded, leaving behind only fleeting recollections among older patrons who still remember the comforting swirl of sugary pastry from their youth. Number 10. Shule Pie slices. Though Shule Pie has deep roots in Pennsylvania Dutch country, 1960s bakery counters across broader regions often carried slices of this dark, molasses-based dessert to appeal to travelers craving something different. The combination of crumb topping and gooey molasses interior gave it a unique flavor reminiscent of early American baking. Gen X individuals on the cusp of the baby boomer generation might remember seeing it featured in diners or small bakeries during family road trips. As the 1970s progressed, however, many mainstream pastry counters moved toward fruit pies with more universal appeal. Larger commercial brands focused on apple, cherry, or pumpkin flavors for nationwide distribution, gradually phasing out specialized pies like Shule. The bold molasses taste didn't fit the evolving popular palate, especially as processed sweeteners became the norm. Over time, Shule Pie became a regional curiosity rather than a nationwide fixture. By the early 1980s, it was almost impossible to find in many states outside of the Pennsylvania region. Nostalgia for old America lingered, but the national bakery scene no longer embraced this heritage dessert in a broad market context. Number 11, lemon chiffon squares. Light, airy, and tangy, lemon chiffon squares took off during the 1960s, when chiffon cakes had a sweeping moment of fame thanks to post-war recipe pamphlets. Bakeries cleverly shaped them into bars or squares for convenient serving, dusted with powdered sugar or topped with a glossy lemon glaze. Baby boomers often enjoyed these bright, citrusy confections at birthdays, office parties, or on visits to small coffee shops. Over time, though, the heavier American desserts, like fudge brownies and thick cheesecakes, began capturing more attention. The delicate chiffon texture required careful handling, which didn't mesh well with the rising trend of pre-packaged goods. By the 1970s, large-scale production lines found these squares too fragile for mass shipping, so bakers either changed recipes to heavier pound cake bases or dropped them entirely. This departure signaled a shift away from the refined airiness that characterized mid-century American nostalgia. Only specialty tea rooms or fancy catering companies occasionally maintained lemon chiffon squares on their menus, leaving ordinary consumers with fleeting references in vintage recipe cards and baby boomer recollections from simpler times. Number 12, hummingbird cake slices. Though hummingbird cake is still known in some southern regions today, it saw its widest national bakery presence in the 1960s, when pineapple, bananas, and coconut flavors soared in popularity across America. The pastry's name and tropical twist appealed to a generation charmed by retro tiki culture, old commercials, and rock and roll vibes. Local bakery windows showcased decadent slices, with cream cheese frosting and toasted pecans, drawing in baby boomers with sweet, fruity aromas. However, as the 1970s introduced an array of convenience cake mixes, particularly in mainstream grocery stores, hummingbird cake's scratch-made format demanded time that bigger chains found impractical. After a while, national interest waned, overshadowed by straightforward chocolate or vanilla layer cakes more suitable for mass production. By the 1980s, if a bakery offered hummingbird cake, it was often restricted to certain southern states or specialized upscale bakeries. Many once ubiquitous shops phased out this layered tropical treat, relegating it to a nostalgic piece of 1960s cultural flair that most present-day consumers have rarely encountered unless they delve into old cookbooks or travel to regions preserving the tradition. Number 13, date nut bread loaves. Often wrapped in wax paper at local bake shops, date nut bread loaves were a quick pick for families seeking hearty, naturally sweet slices during the 1960s. The combination of chopped dates and walnuts or pecans offered a dense, flavorful profile that many older Americans linked to Depression-era recipes. Baby boomers might remember their parents or grandparents pairing a slice of this moist bread with cream cheese for a lunchtime sandwich. Yet, as the fast food culture expanded in the 1970s, subtle desserts like date nut bread began to feel outdated compared to flashy, new snack cakes and sweet rolls heavily promoted in big media campaigns. Moreover, dried fruit and nut loaves required more specialized ingredients not always cost-effective in bulk bakery operations. Gradual changes in distribution networks favored pastries with a longer shelf life or more universal flavors. By the 1980s, date nut bread emerged only around holiday seasons or at niche health food stores. The mainstream bakery scene no longer highlighted it as a daily staple, turning it into a memory-laden relic from the 20th century's simpler repertoire. Number 14, buttermilk chess squares. During the 1960s, chess pie and its variations were a point of pride in many American kitchens, especially in the South. But the practice of selling chess squares by the slice at bakeries also cropped up in various states. These custard-like bars combined cornmeal, sugar, butter, and tangy buttermilk to create a gooey, sweet treat with a hint of savory complexity. Gen X individuals who grew up with older boomer relatives might recall them proudly displayed in bakery windows or at community bake sales. However, once larger supermarket bakeries standardized their offerings, the distinct flavor of chess desserts no longer fit the streamlined, widely appealing lineup. The squares were either too sweet for some or too unfamiliar for broader markets. Over time, simpler alternatives like sugar cookie bars or lemon bars supplanted them. By the 1970s, only region-specific shops kept them going. And by the 1980s, national recognition faded fast. Nowadays, chess squares survive primarily in particular southern states or among families who pass down old handwritten recipe cards referencing those nostalgic 1960s tastes. Number 15, Parker House rolls in wax bags. Although Parker House rolls date to an even earlier century, they were a ubiquitous presence in many 1960s neighborhood bakeries, sold in small wax paper bags for take-home dinners. Their fluffy, buttery texture and folded design were widely associated with special occasions and Sunday meals. Baby boomers who grew up in suburban neighborhoods recall parents grabbing a bag before heading home to complete the family dinner table. However, by the 1970s, large grocery chains and discount bread brands started offering packaged dinner rolls that lasted longer on shelves, negating the need for local bakeries to churn out fresh Parker House rolls daily. The convenience factor of mass-produced bread overshadowed the slightly higher cost and limited shelf life of homemade versions. Over time, families gravitated toward simpler, more readily available bread options. By the 1980s, the once familiar wax bags gave way to plastic packaging, and the Parker House rolls themselves lost traction in mainstream shops. Some upscale restaurants or old-line hotels still feature them, but the humble bakery version that reigned in the 1960s mostly slipped into nostalgic memory. Number 16. Jelly rolls with homemade preserves. In 1960s, bakeries' delicate sponge cakes rolled around fruity preserves or jam were a common sight. Often dusted with powdered sugar or topped with whipped cream, these jelly rolls required skillful techniques to ensure the cake layers didn't crack while rolling. Local bakers sometimes used homemade preserves from regionally grown berries, adding a personal, artisanal flair. Older baby boomers in rural communities might remember seeing them at fundraiser bakes, church socials, or old American diners. Over time, though, the complexity of preparing real sponge cakes overshadowed the convenience of simpler sheet cakes. In the 1970s, as chain bakeries strived for uniform product lines and reduced labor, the homemade jam-filling practice was replaced with pre-processed fruit spreads. Mass producers found jelly rolls fragile for packaging and shipping, so other stable iced cakes rose in popularity. By the 1980s, the once everyday treat turned into a niche specialty item or a holiday novelty. Those who yearn for it now typically try to recreate it at home using vintage recipes, recalling the tastes once standard in 1960s local bakeries. Number 17. Fruitcake slices year-round. While fruitcake is often associated with Christmas, it enjoyed wider availability in the 1960s, with some bakeries offering sliced fruitcake throughout the year, especially in areas with strong European immigrant influences. The candied fruits and nuts signified an old-world tradition that baby boomers might remember sampling at grandparents' houses or seeing in old commercials. Demand for fruitcake slices dipped significantly as the 1970s ushered in streamlined dessert assortments, focusing on year-round crowd pleasers like chocolate or vanilla layer cakes. Over time, fruitcake gained a somewhat notorious reputation as a dense holiday punchline, further undermining its day-to-day appeal. Mass production of lower-quality fruitcakes also eroded consumer desire for the real bakery version. By the 1980s, bakeries mostly saved fruitcake for the holiday rush, and the concept of year-round slices vanished outside of specialty shops catering to older generations. Although die-hard devotees might still track it down, it no longer graces typical bakery displays, rendering it a footnote of 20th century American nostalgia. Number 18, crullers in lard-fried style. The lard-fried twisted dough known as crullers was once a mainstay in small American bakeries, with a legacy stretching back to the 1930s. By the 1960s, they remained widely popular among local shops and family-run diners. The airy interior and crisp exterior, achieved by frying in rendered lard or a blend of fats, lent an old-fashioned flavor baby boomers still reminisce about. As large donut chains and automated frying lines rose to power in the 1970s, vegetable shortening or refined oils replaced lard in the quest for uniformity. Traditional crullers proved more complicated to produce en masse than simpler ring donuts. Consequently, big chain outlets phased out the delicate twisting technique. By the 1980s, authentic lard-fried crullers grew scarce, leaving them largely to archaic recipe books or small-town shops clinging to old methods. For those who grew up in mid-century America, the memory of biting into a flaky cruller on a weekend morning lives on, even if these pastries have practically vanished from contemporary bakery offerings. Number 19. Moravian sugar cake slices. Originating from communities with German heritage, Moravian sugar cake found its way into a variety of bakeries throughout the mid-Atlantic region in the 1960s. The yeasted dough, pressed with indentations to hold brown sugar, butter, and cinnamon, created a sweet and lightly crunchy topping. Baby boomers might recall visiting local festivals where slices of this cake were served warm, reminiscent of old America's communal gatherings. However, the specialized ingredient ratios and slow-rising process required to produce a perfect Moravian sugar cake weren't conducive to modern commercial scale. As the 1970s introduced speedier bakery models, this old-world treat struggled to remain profitable or widely recognizable. Larger bakery chains concentrated on universal crowd pleasers, and by the 1980s, Moravian sugar cake was no longer easily found in mainstream grocery outlets. In certain pockets of the country, it endures as a cherished local specialty, but nationwide, it became one of those ephemeral 20th century baked goods that quietly slipped from store shelves into the realm of nostalgic childhood recollections. Number 20. Cherry Wink cookies. Prominent during the 1960s in many home kitchens and smaller bakeries, Cherry Wink cookies combined crushed cornflakes, maraschino cherries, and sometimes chopped nuts for a crunchy yet soft treat. They exuded a playful, bright appearance that appealed to baby boomers seeking vibrant flavors in old commercials or family gatherings. Bakeries would often spotlight these cookies around festive times, and they were popular with children. Yet their reliance on maraschino cherries and heavy use of sugary coatings eventually felt out of place as the health-conscious trends of the 1970s and 1980s took hold. The cookies also required more delicate assembly and a final garnish with halved cherries, making them less ideal for mass production. By the 1980s, the wave of chunk chocolate cookies and simpler sugar cookies nudged Cherry Winks aside. Maraschino cherries began losing popularity outside of cocktails, and large bakery operations found it more efficient to churn out classic chocolate chip varieties in bulk. As a result, Cherry Wink cookies vanished from most bakery menus, leaving them as a fond memory among those old enough to recall that distinctive pinkish hue and sugary crunch during the heyday of mid-century America.